Hello, and welcome to another lock-in at the Crate and Crowbar. On this occasion, discussing and needlessly ranking the most recent incarnation of the James Bond film franchise, which ran from 2006 to 2021, with Daniel Craig in the starring role. I'm Marsh Davis, and joining me tonight, strapped to a gurney being etched by lasers over a shark-filled pool, is the International Charm Offensive, codenamed Tom Senior.
Good evening.
Tom, what's your feeling about Bond? What's your history with Bond? Did you grow up watching Bond?
I did grow up watching Bond, and I have therefore a kind of ingrained built-in automatic affection for the series, in spite of all its kind of strange camp weirdness and at moments incredibly problematic
Yeah.
ideas. And yeah, I'm always drawn to it. I'll always try and go see it at the cinema or catch it eventually. And I've seen them all, and some of them a few different times. And I find it fascinating as a kind of an action film series, but also as a kind of capitalist object that essentially exists, especially in the modern era, to sell a very specific type of masculinity. And it's interesting to see what kind of trinkets it chooses to push in front of you as kind of status symbols. The things Bond wears, the things he drinks, the things like his watches, everything is all kind of built into this very specific type of idea about what a cool man might look like in the modern world. So yeah, it's fascinating stuff.
Yeah, it's really interesting to pick apart the series in terms of its purpose versus what is actually laudable about it versus what I might want it to be.
Mm.
And I think all of those things are probably pulling in very different directions.
Oh yeah,
But we will definitely get into that as we go along.
Mm.
I mean, I grew up watching the Brosnan Bonds. You're a bit younger than I am, I think, but I imagine they were on at the cinema at the time you were of a cinema going age.
They're the ones I grew up on as well, definitely.
Well, I don't know about you, but they sort of chart a pretty crucial period of my adolescence of sort of critical dawning. Like the first one came out when I was 12,
Right.
GoldenEye. And obviously that is a fucking amazing film
I
for a
love
12-year-old
GoldenEye.
to see.
I love GoldenEye.
But then by the time Die Another Day comes out, I was 19 and it was a shit film.
No,
So
I think whatever age you're at, that is an absolute dreck. It is an unbelievably bad film. I remember rewatching it a few years ago. I thought, I was being too harsh on it. No, things are a mess.
Yeah, but I think maybe because of that, but also because at 19 I was trying to be a really cool guy. And trying to be cool in a cool way, and The Matrix had come out, and James Bond just felt quite silly at the time.
Yeah.
Notwithstanding the invisible cars and all of that nonsense. But like you, I feel like the franchise has this hold over me in a way in which I feel very, very, very embarrassed to admit. Like it feels like a national myth in a way.
Yeah.
And it's one I bought into as a child, just like the idea that, we are the good guys and Britain has this fella going around nobbling the bad dudes all over the world. And it doesn't matter that it's not legal at all because it's right. And only we can do it because we're a moral power in a messy world. And I don't know that I thought about it in those terms, but it's definitely a kind of level of indoctrination that you come away from as a Brit from these films. And I feel a bit of a weird nationalistic pride about Bond. Even though I hate nationalism and I kind of hate Bond.
Yeah. It's surprising to me that it exports so well. I wonder why it has such a kind of it does so well globally, even though it is this massively indulgent vision of what people might think Britain was in the super spy era. And I also just kind of find it endlessly fascinating the conversation between James Bond and the actual intelligence services, who I think for one of the films they put out a double-page newspaper spread, spent loads of money saying, this isn't actually what we do. Please don't think that we actually just murder people all over the place. I don't know. There's always a national conversation around Bond as well, and it's sort of lurching attempts to move with the times in often tokenistic and stupid ways. It's also part of its appeal to me.
Yeah.
And I share the thing you said when you said you felt slightly embarrassed about loving it. But I think it's okay because I think unless you actually want to be James Bond and think he's great, you're probably fine.
Yeah, I wonder. I mean, because as I sort of slowly across the course of my life awoke to all the many problems with Bond, I began to feel very differently about Bond and reading things that were critical of Bond, like Alan Moore's comic, which deals with the sort of Bond surrogate, in which he sort of quite expertly picks apart all the problems with Bond as a character.
Mm.
Uh, I began to really welcome the idea of a reboot which sort of addressed these things. But now I'm not sure whether I don't know whether there was ever a kind of sufficiency of earnestness with addressing those things that could have carried it through. I
Mm.
feel like, Bond sort of ends up sliding back into this sort of glib and sort of camp thing, even though it sort of pays lip service to realpolitik. It's going to be interesting as we go through these films one by one.
Yeah.
I should say that we are going to spoil all of the films in depth, and so this is a spoiler warning. If you actually want to experience these films afresh, go away and do so. Oh, before we start though, who's your favourite pre-Craig Bond?
I think it has to be Brosnan. I think it's just I bet this charts everyone the Bond you grow up with is probably the one that you cements Bond as an idea in your mind, and you associate the face and the features and the mannerisms with the character. And Pierce Brosnan was quite a svelte and kind of unflappable, but also very clean Bond in a way that like you never got. He's never gets his suit messed up. He never wears blood or dirt, especially like Daniel Craig does. And I think that was especially in Goldeneye, like he drives a tank through a bridge and then a statue falls down and he adjusts his tie. That's kind of what James Bond was to me growing up. And then it felt weird going back to Sean Connery and being like, oh, this is what the character started out like. It doesn't feel like the same guy, because I think the
Oh, they're
actors.
not.
No, they're not. But also the actors bring a lot to Bond, and
Yeah.
which is kind of fascinating because Bond never says anything interesting, really. Like, never like the actual words coming out of his face aren't particularly, important to anything. But the delivery and the kind of mannerisms and the way the actors hold themselves while playing Bond, all of that actually that's what Bond is really to me as an essence on screen.
Yeah, I think Sean Connery for me actually, even though I did grow up with Pierce Brosnan, and I think I prefer the Pierce Brosnan films.
Mm.
Well, at least film. I love Goldeneye.
Yeah, that's the one.
But Pierce Brosnan, like you say, he's very clean. But he's not at all deep or relatable as a
No,
character there, and
no.
he's not at all required to be. But there's something about Sean Connery that invites a bit more kind of complexity, and I don't know that it's really about his performance so much as his person. Like he
Mm.
just has a sort of personable quality to him, as well as being suave. Whereas Brosnan was just kind of smooth in quite a cold way, and I feel like Sean Connery also has that edge to him where he's kind of rugged and feral. And I think
Yeah.
there's that famous. I can't remember. It was one of the Broccolis, I believe, who was trying to convince Ian Fleming that Connery was right for the role, and she said that he moves like a panther. And I think that's absolutely right. Like there's a
Mm.
kind of ambiguous quality to him, just physically, which is kind of alluring and threatening, and that just brings a kind of complexity to the role through his presence. Even though, you know, acting wise, the things he says, the films he's in aren't necessarily particularly good.
Mm.
And I feel the same way about Craig, actually. I feel like Daniel Craig has that sort of kind of pivot to him where he can be sort of charming and kind of affable, but at the same time, there's a kind of a glimmer of a killer in his eyes as
Yeah,
well.
absolutely right.
Never liked Roger Moore, though,
No,
at all.
no.
Like, even though some of those films are fun, I just found him extraordinarily, almost like emetically creepy, before even really having like any kind of social conscience regarding Bond as like a terminal sex pest. I
Mm.
just found Moore to be just a repellent presence in all these films.
Yeah,
But I understand that's controversial. Some people hold Roger Moore very dearly to their hearts,
yeah,
and they're perverts.
I never gelled with Roger Moore. He felt like a bit of a carry-on character in a way that was just kind of gurning
Mm.
for the camera in a way that I never the raised eyebrow and everything. I never quite got on with him, and then the rest all sort of blur into one a little bit for me.
Yeah.
That's
I,
the trouble.
I understand people have fond feelings towards Dalton, etc.
Mm.
But I've watched them so long ago they didn't make a lasting impression on me. I'm
Yeah,
afraid.
same,
But
same.
should we talk about Casino Royale?
Yes,
2006 is when it came out. It was
so
directed by Martin Campbell, who previously directed Goldeneye, and also the brilliant British TV drama Edge of Darkness,
long.
and the terrible film reboot of Edge of Darkness
Let's not talk
with Mel
about
Gibson.
that. No.
So
Every time I remember that exists, it's awful. Watch the original TV series though; it's great.
yeah, and really dark in alarming, taboo ways, which would never be made as a television series today.
It's terrifying, actually terrifying. So
Yeah. And it's interesting because it's returning to even though this is a reboot, famously intended to be a reboot in under the shadow of the sort of Bourne Identity. They bring back two writers from sort of almost the campist end of the Brosnan films, Neil Purvis and Robert Wade, who had previously done Plunkett and McLean, which was a sort of comedy period drama featuring two of the stars of Trainspotting, Robert Carlyle and Johnny Lee Miller. And it was not very good at all. But for some reason, this caught the eye of one of the Broccolis, and they were ushered into the Bond franchise on The World Is Not Enough, and they returned for Die Another Day, and then they made Johnny English.
oh my goodness.
And somehow they retain credits on all of the Craig era Bonds too. And what happens almost every time, like throughout the history of the Craig era Bonds, is a director comes on board, usually kind of like an auteur director. I know Danny Boyle was attached to it at one point. And they say, no, we're bringing in our own writer team. We have our own bold vision for this. And then the project sort of comes off the rails somewhere. And I would assume there are some sort of creative differences with the producers who maybe have their own idea of what Bond should be and return to. And somehow Neil Purvis and Robert Wade always end up coming back on board. I don't know whether that's to a positive effect on the projects, because you can never tell what people wrote. But I wonder if the way that the Craig films sort of end up kind of start off gritty reboot and end up veering back towards sort of rote Bond tick boxing to some extent. I wonder if that is the effect of those writers' influence from Bonds of yore coming back on board and trying to wrest it back into a shape which the producers are happier with. That's complete speculation. I have no evidence to back that up.
It's a good theory. I like that.
And also joining them on the screenplay writing business is Paul Haggis, who directed Crash and wrote $1 Million Baby and Letters to Iwo Jima. And I assume he is there to bring some sort of, chin-strokey heft to Casino Royale.
I think it's interesting with movie credits. Sometimes people get drafted in. Often this is what the executive producer role is, I understand, where just attaching names is also an act of marketing. Or a favour to someone in a studio somewhere who wants to attach a certain person to a certain project to, grease the wheels, whatever. So it's very hard to tell, like, who wrote what and who drafted what when, and who actually had an influence over the final script, which I think the script seems decent to me in Casino Royale. A film that I greatly enjoyed, actually, I would say.
Yeah. So I'll give a brief synopsis, shall I?
Yeah, go for it.
So it's the series has been rebooted back to a freshly blooded 00 agent. Bond is now tasked with disrupting the plans of Le Chiffre, who's a banker who short sells stock on successful companies, then engineers terrorist attacks to tank their share prices. And MI6 believe that Le Chiffre is part of a larger organization and that they can get information on that organization if they flip him by applying a lot of pressure. So Bond foils an attack on an airline organized by Le Chiffre, and Le Chiffre is forced to hold a high-stakes poker game in order to win back the funds he's lost before his various debts come due. But Bond is also going to face him at the table in the Casino Royale.
Nice. This is a very good film. I watched it last week, and I was like, wow, it races along, and it's like so. It felt like it was a reboot that was trying to return to Fleming's vision of Bond as kind of a thug, a misogynist thug. And the very first introduction you get to Daniel Craig as Bond is him kicking the crap out of someone in a bog somewhere. As he has a gun in this kind of black and white sequence on a mastermind. He sort of the mastermind asks him about his goon. How did he die? And Bond just says badly, and then it cuts to him absolutely bludgeoning this man to death with the sink. And then the following kind of chase sequence basically is a big kind of statement about what they want to do with Bond. They want to use Daniel Craig's heft and physical presence to make him a kind of battering ram. So there's this informant who runs from Bond, and he's a parkour master, and he's kind of vaulting through cranes and across the landscape. And Bond is literally running through walls. He just runs through walls, just
Yeah.
emerges on the other side and poses and then henches, like flexes, and then just runs through another wall. And it's like, okay, all right, it's a bit different to Brosnan. A little bit, a touch different. And he's just got a filthy and just like a very funny bit where at the end the guy just pulls a gun on Bond. On top of a crane, implausibly, and then fires and realizes the gun's empty, throws the gun at Daniel Craig. Bond catches it, just bashes him with it. And it's just, it's the guy who has a very brute force way of doing things. And if he gets within 6 feet of you, he will just win. That's kind of his whole strategy to approaching every problem that he kind of comes across in Casino Royale. But then you go into this really interesting, tense poker game in the middle as well, where everyone at the table has some kind of interesting backstory and reason for being there that's gradually revealed, even as during the breaks between hands, Bond has to fight off assassins and then get poisoned at one point. And it's an absolute riot. It's so much fun. And Bond is kind of like this icy, pretty awful person who, I don't know. What was your take on it?
Oh yeah, all of those things definitely. I love the fact that the Bond in this is young and he's inexperienced, but he's also overconfident and he's
Right.
petulant and he's naive and he's incredibly fallible. Like I mean, he obviously he can do a good punch, but it doesn't signal to me really the film that he is a hero in the same way that
That's true.
other Bonds and later Bonds do. You feel that Daniel Craig's young Bond could really do anything and not necessarily the right thing. And
Mm.
that's actually quite scintillating to watch. He makes choices, and you don't know whether he is making a morally good choice at all. And I think, although I like Craig throughout his run as Bond, I think the more kind of explicitly heroic he gets, the less interesting he becomes. I
Mm.
firmly believe that like Bond is at least in the text something of a villain,
Yeah.
or easily could be. I think that's the interesting thing about him. He is a gorilla in a tuxedo, and I think it's important because the later films sort of flirt with actual grown-up ideas about Britain's new role in the world and stuff, but it never has the follow-through because Bond's moral compass is sort of unassailable. But I think in this film, it's very much in question, and I think that's quite exciting to watch. And exactly what you say about its sort of containment on a single long evening in a single place. I think that's really good for several reasons. I think it gives the film like this structure and identity, which is all its own, but also that the constraints of that location force interesting writing
Mm.
out of the filmmakers. And and it also signals that it's not just simply following formula. I think that's a real problem with the later Craig Bonds. Is that after this sort of bold beginning, they end up falling back on sort of box checking Bond cliches like, oh,
Yeah.
we have to move continents every 20 minutes. Oh, we have to have a villainous sidekick with a funny hat. And, oh, we have to have a showdown in the villain's secret hideout. But Casino Royale doesn't have a big villain showdown. It doesn't have
No.
a secret hideout. And it shows you that you literally don't need any of that. You can just make a good film and Bond will take care of himself,
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
it's not like, but also at the same time, it's not like Casino Royale isn't in dialogue with the Bonds of the past. He still, he still swiftly beds a woman and gets her killed.
Mm.
But a point is being made with that about how bad that is. And yet the subsequent films sort of repeat that trope because it's now a thing that Bond does. But in Casino Royale, it feels like it has something to say with that. My only wish is that it had been sort of the final word on that, really.
Oh, it sure wasn't.
No.
It sure was a trope that was repeated in very different contexts that delivered very different messages about how cool Bond was by doing this. He's there's a bit like where who's played brilliantly by Judi Dench, who's a real shining light in the whole series of Craig films. She's always excellent, and Casino Royale does a really good job of establishing her relationship with Bond as being kind of fractious, and her in this film very much reluctantly having to use him, knowing that he could just cause terrible damage to British interest if he goes in the wrong direction. And there's a bit where she talks about, I think she says something like, before she explains a bit of plot, it's like, this may be too much for a blunt instrument to understand, but
Mm.
and it's like, yes, yeah, that is kind of when a line comes up for a film like that, it gives you a framework to see the character as this fallible, monstrous thing, and not as kind of big superhero Bond. It's having someone just say that, leave it out in the air, even just like before you get on with the exposition. I think just is a really, really useful way into sort of asking the audience to question whether Bond, who randomly just punches people and kills people all the time, whether he's actually kind of doing it for any particular reason other than his own. I think it's a
Mm.
really savvy moments like that that make this film much more interesting than any of the other Craig era films, I think.
Oh yeah. I'm interested to ask you about the action and what your recollection of it was, because I remember it being sort of a response to the Bourne films by becoming grittily realistic. But actually, that's not really the case. Like, there's a lot of grim violence in it. Like the expression of that action is much more violent explicitly than in
Mm.
previous Bond films, I'd say. But it's still quite cheeky and glib. Like, he still evades bullets with this supernatural sort of
Yeah,
level of
100%.
luck. And he like pursue, you know, in that brilliant parkour sequence when he plows through walls, he's sort of following like this inbuilt sat nav for how this half-built
Yeah, that's true.
building's working. Um,
Yeah, they
and but then there's a later fight in the stairwell, which is
really
genuinely
good.
grim.
Yeah.
You know, what was your memory of that, of the kind of tenor of the action, and how did it match up with it? I'm watching it again now.
I think my initial memory was of the gritty stuff. I'd have forgotten how silly that opening action sequence actually is. It wasn't until rewatching it, the parkour chase sequence, that I realized how ludicrous it was. And you know, it starts on the ground and goes literally through a building, like through the walls, and then up onto the top of a crane on the dock. And it's absolutely nonsense if you stop to question it for even a split second. But it's very, very entertaining. The bits I remembered were the punch ups in the bathroom, the punch up in the stairwell, and because I think because of marketing, the bit where he flips the supercar, tries to
Mm.
avoid hitting Vesper. Just
Yeah, it
and
doesn't
that
make any sense, but I do like the fact they threw away that car straight away.
it's
You know.
really funny actually. Yeah,
Mm.
they do one joke with it where I think like there's a thing where I think he's talking to Vesper and taking her back to, she's like, oh, do you live nearby? And he says yes, and she gets in the car and he just drives around the car park and then parks back up to the hotel
Oh
again,
yeah.
which is nice, and then immediately crashes the car, and like the next scene the car's in. which is funny because obviously many other films just like they slaver over the car, including the latest one, like that for some reason.
Mhm.
Again, it's one of these kind of very, very labored, pretty out of date, silly kind of badges of masculinity that the film is still absolutely obsessed with, probably for contract reasons and advertising reasons, that they just have a car and it has to be just unattainable, but then you get the close-up shot of a logo. um
Mhm.
so it's nice to see it just pop up and then get immediately wrecked. It's really funny.
Yeah.
And it's a spectacular wreckage as well. Like, it's a credit to whoever set up the weird ramp that made it sort of flip 10 times sideways into a ditch. Very good.
Yeah, I mean, sort of talking of these sorts of Bond tropes, I think his relationship with Vesper is sort of again, like the final word on Bond girls, like how he is treated by Vesper, how they eventually find a burgeoning love between them, and the fear he has that he's going to be betrayed, and everything after feels like that was everything that needed to be said about all the preceding Bond girls.
Mm.
And then subsequent films have been like, well, who's our Vesper this time? And you're like, no, no,
No, yeah.
no, that's not what, that's not the point of it, you know? But
Oh,
I really like Eva Green's performance
yeah.
and how she just completely. What's clever about it is she completely ruins Bond's trust in a believable way because he's such a petulant and unempathic asshole, whilst somehow letting the audience know that his anger is totally unwarranted. And there's
Yeah.
like there's some subtlety in pulling that off, I think.
Yeah. And the biggest line in the film is bit at the end where Bond's on the photo, I think M or someone, after Vesper's died, and he's like, "Job's done. The bitch is dead."
Mm.
And it's a pretty heavy line to drop in. It's the first time Bond almost never swears, and even this kind of very minor, relatively mild swear word. it's delivered with such venom that it's actually a pretty kind of almost a risky thing to drop in the framework of what's essentially can often be perceived as being a superhero film.
Yeah.
So I think you're right that the Casino Royale evades those trappings and isn't a superhero film at all, and doesn't feel like one. It feels like it's kind of messy, brutal kind of action film with a significant love interest to it, and that him dropping that line is actually kind of the cruelest thing he does in that film. It feels like the
Mm.
weight of it, and I think that I think that lands in Casino Royale in the way that he, the way he treats his women, the Bond women, in the rest of the films just doesn't at all.
Yeah.
And it's unfortunate because you're right, it could have reframed that, but then in the very next in that the next film or at the end of the film, they start naming cocktails after Vesper, and in these agonizing moments of kind of product placement, where someone always asks Bond what he's drinking, martini shaken, not Solace,
Mm.
of course. But they turn that in these films into double Gordon's gin, house vodka, thin shave of lemon. I call it the Vesper. And it's like, no, don't make her into this, please. What? That you've laboured to create this character that's going to motivate Bond for the next X number of films, and actually kind of perhaps change him as a person,
Mm.
a sense of loss, and the fact that he should perhaps care about people sometimes. No, it's a cocktail now, and the dialogue is so honkingly awful that they're trying to make it happen. They
Mm.
want bars across the world to sell the Vesper, and it's like, no, it's so horrible.
But on another point, he asked for a vodka martini, and the waiter asked him whether he wants it shaken or stirred, and he says, "Do I look like I give a damn?"
That's cool. Yeah.
It's a bit on the nose in terms of like a response to preceding Bonds, but it's still a good line. I reckon they had that one as the line, and then somebody said, "Oh, but what are we going to do with our Gordon's gin partnership, guys?"
Exactly right. Yeah. Yeah.
There is a just to say on Vespa for one more moment. Uh, Obviously, Bond has issues with asking consent, as we see throughout
Oh,
this run
yeah.
of movies.
Mm.
But there is a weird extra place for it to go when he comforts Vesper in the shower, having just brutally murdered two men in her
Right.
presence, and he begins to suck her fingers.
Oh,
And
yeah, yeah, yeah,
like,
yeah.
it is that seems so strikingly odd to
Mm,
me. I don't know if it's odd in a intentional creepy edge of darkness way,
mm.
or whether it's just a absolute clanger. What do you think?
I don't know. That's a really good point. Like, it's one of those moments where, like, he starts doing it, and it's like, "What is happening?" Like, and what's weird is, like, she's completely indifferent to it.
Yeah.
Obviously, she's like, it's like I know, like, she's been traumatized by seeing people brutally murdered by Bond in a stairwell. But then, like, it's because it's also not alluring in the slightest. It's just a
Mm,
very, very strange thing to do,
yeah.
especially in that moment. Uh, and
Yeah.
I don't know. I find it hard to be charitable about it, really, because throughout the advances that Bond makes, I think, like, sometimes it's intended to be sexy in some way, but
Yeah.
honkingly, awfully isn't, and in a way that you'd hope that writers would catch.
Right. A lot of the kind of other outside of that scene, a lot of the kind of sexy tete-a-tete verbal jousting that they do is absolutely terrible.
Yeah, it's unbelievably bad.
So
Yeah.
yeah, I'm willing to believe that the writers just don't know what it is like to talk to a woman. But yeah. Hmm. I think it's on safer ground with the villain, though. I think Mads
Oh,
Mikkelsen
yes.
as Le Chiffre is a superb,
He's so good.
small,
He's small,
grimy
that's right.
little man,
Yeah, I love.
scrapping over a measly $100 million.
Yes, yes.
That's what's so good about it. I think Bond works really well at that scale.
Mm.
Strangely, even though previous Bonds have all been about shark tanks and volcano bases, but I think that's wrong.
I
It's
love.
great that they've got this little sweaty dude who's just
Yeah,
horrible.
this desperate weasel who's of all the motivations the Bond villains have, he just needs some money. There are people coming to break his legs, and he needs some money, and he has this ridiculously, like, extraordinarily, circuitous way of getting that money, which is awesome because it involves a poker game. But also, like, Mads Mikkelsen is just great at staring across a table at someone. Like, he's so good at that. But he's also, like, when he's literally towards the end of the film bashing Bond's balls in a painful scene to watch. He's actually like he gets desperate and angry, and Bond gets to him, and then like again he sort of Mads Mikkelsen's character kind of regresses to this sort of childish. Just fury. It's like, just give me the money. Route One just needs this thing to survive. It's almost, uh, it's
He's
very
almost
relatable.
sympathetic in his desperation, I think. I think that's
Yes,
one of the things that I quite like about it. And he's not meant to be killed either. Like MI6
that's true.
want him on their side, and yet there's no boss battle, there's no big
No,
showdown, no buildings explode. He just they do, but later. But and he's just wiped out, by
yeah,
another criminal agency. And I think that's what I we'll definitely get onto this, but I think a lot of the later Bonds, especially the ones by Sam Mendes, are all so desperate to discuss what Bond is and isn't, and its themes. And actually, this film just is happy to show that you can dispense with them and do something different without having to kind of flag it all the time.
mm,
That line about not caring about whether it's shaken or stirred aside, the fact that it without comment changes the kind of formula or dispenses with the formula entirely, I think is the most interesting thing
yeah.
about it.
And I wasn't expecting the final sort of phase of the film at all when I was watching it the first time in the cinema. I thought that was the end of the film basically, and then Bond goes into the sunset, and then the sunset keeps happening, and then the sunset keeps happening. I was like, oh, this film isn't ending yet. So and then they have this beautiful life, and they go around the world, and it's still not ending. It was like, oh no, and then this sort of danger warning sirens start going off, and you're like, oh no, it's like a new film has started, and you're just waiting for this paradise to be punctured by something horrible. And when it is, for that to be the kind of the finish to the film and the final moment, Bond becomes like regresses to becoming truly bitter and psychopathic killer again. I think like that's a hard. I imagine that's a hard sell to get through. As a blockbuster film, to not have the boss battle, not have the final third, just not have the explosions, but to have this very character-driven sequence, admittedly with some pretty ridiculous explosions when she does actually die, but to actually kind of make that the focus of the end of the film is actually really, I thought, was really effective and unexpected. And I wish I also just kind of rejected the act structure a bit by sort of starting something a bit new at the end that I wasn't perhaps expecting. So I thought, yeah, it's a great film. It's such a good watch as well, and it's about 2 hours long. It's a sensible length, which
Yes.
most of the other ones are not. They just get longer and longer. It's like Harry Potter, just end. It's like growing and growing. Like this weird bacterial sponge monster. She just can't. Desperately needs an editor.
Yeah. Should we move on to Quantum of Solace?
Let's. Yeah.
Firstly, what a fucking name, right? Jesus Christ!
Wow, wow. It's been said so many times, but wow, though, like that's a choice.
Because this one was directed by Mark Forster, who's in an odd and possibly questionable choice, I would say, having previously directed Monsters Ball, Finding Neverland, and I'm not sure if he had directed or was about to direct World War Z at this point. None of which are great films, I don't think, actually. But the writing team of the first film is back: Paul Haggis, Neil Purvis, and Robert Wade. It picks up where the first film left off. Bond is on the scent of the organization that operated and ultimately killed the Chiffre. And the trail leads him to a company called Quantum and a weaselly environmentalist called Dominic Green. It seems Green and the mysterious cabal, of which he is a part, is helping to stage a coup in Bolivia with the secret aim of securing ownership of the country's water supply, which will then be held to ransom. And then part of a telescope array explodes for literally no reason. I don't think much of this film, Tom. I think I kind of hate it, actually. But I have to say, rewatching it now, after being pleasantly surprised by Casino Royale, and that Casino Royale was still as good as I thought it was, Quantum of Solace really manages to recapture the same sense of total deflation I felt in the cinema the first time round. It's just a really poorly constituted film, I think, by comparison. And I actually quite like the overall plot, which I think, with this kind of coup in the this environmental services company, it feels like it still feels quite restrained on the scale of Bond villainy.
Yeah.
But it's still an escalation on Le Chiffre. Um, Although I do find the idea that like an environmental services company could actually be a front for a evil empire is a bit like a plot point from a Spectator columnist's first political thriller. But Dominic Green, played by Matthew Amalric, is really good, and in
Yeah.
a similar way to Mads Mikkelsen, in that he's a very, very sweaty little man,
Oily.
and he's weak and vicious, and he has glistening goblin eyes and a little feral smirk.
Yeah. You've got a great hunch as well that the actor really gets into it. It's very good.
Yeah, the whole oil exploitation bait and switch with the water supply. It's not quite as subtle a plan as the film thinks it can hand wave us into believing, but I think it's a good premise, and I like the CIA's role in it with Felix Leiter and David Harbour as Greg Beam as a bent station chief. Though that just sort of passes out; they just disappear from the film in the end.
Yeah,
I don't know, but even though I like some aspects of it, I think that the thing that is bad about it, that is enduringly poor throughout, is that the construction of the film, in terms of its cinematography and editing,
yeah,
is just
100%.
nauseating. I think it's just
It's always
close cropped, cut to incoherence. Like a lot of the action scenes are spliced with cuts back to irrelevant civilian drama. Like there's an opera and a horse race, and it cuts back and forth in between this and whatever's going on with Bond, to the extent that you cannot invest in any sense of continuity. And like there's a bit in the opening where Bond's chasing a dude, and the dude he's chasing brushes past this old woman who's hauling this crate of fruit up a stairwell, and the fruit drops. And like I counted this, there are at least 7 cuts to show the fruit basket falling over, and that's a generously few cuts that I'm counting there, depending on when you start and stop counting. And it's of absolutely no consequence to the actual chase at all. It's just in the way, and I feel like those problems just extend beyond just the moment-to-moment scenes. Like there's, I don't know, I wouldn't call it a continuity problem as such, because the problem is really that the filmmakers didn't think that there was a problem at all. So there's a point where Bond and Olga Kurilenko literally fall out of a plane and into a styrofoam cave containing a dammed up river. Then they have a heart-to-heart about vengeance, and then they walk through a desert in seconds, and they're into a village full of Bolivians looking in an empty well and shouting "De nada." It's just like, oh, come on, try a little bit harder than that. I don't know. How did you find this poor film?
I don't know if you've ever been in an old bus with poor suspension, and then you perhaps pass from a normal road and over perhaps like a rough road, and the entire cage rattles around you in a way that is like deeply unpleasant, goes up through your ass and into your bones. That's what this film is like to watch as a kind of experience for your brain, in terms of just having no consistency of like focus at any moment in terms of what you're actually literally looking at on the screen. Conversation has been shot from random angles that will change. Like the camera never sits still; it's cutting all over the place, and I was bludgeoned into a kind of stupor by it, to the extent that I just couldn't think about anything else, just because I was just trying to follow what they were trying to do, and it was just on just a brain function level impossible. And I think that's just watching films like this kind of helps me to appreciate actual good film craft, actual good cinematography, and what it takes to actually lead your gaze through the film and lead your gaze across these beautiful vistas. Like it's kind of a film about locations as much as anything. It's like, hey, look at, we're here now. Look at this. Whoa, vista. Cut. Bond. Oh, he's somewhere else now. Oh, desert. Oh, planes. A massive, really extended plane sequence that's horrible and really implausible.
Why does the plane explode? Why does the plane explode?
I don't know.
It's just like they're in front of it and they seem to psych it out, and it just pivots into a mountain.
It cuts inside. Obviously, at like 100 cuts a second, it cuts back and forth, and he just wrenches the wheel to the right, and just immediately crashes into a mountain for no reason at all. It's just so.
I kind of appreciate the brazen exposition, which explains why the building at the end explodes. It's like there's no reason for anybody to be there. It's part of the European Southern Observatory, incidentally, as I was informed by my partner.
Hmm.
And there's no, it's not anybody's secret space home. It's not somebody's poison farm or a missile base or anything. The characters literally go there for no reason.
Yeah,
And then there's this piece of dialogue where one of the characters says, "What's that noise?" "Oh, it's just the fuel cells. The whole
that's
compound
right.
runs on them. Sounds unstable." And then but the thing is, it's not like Bond even detonates it. A car
Mm.
just has a prang in the garage and the entire building goes up. It's just absolute dreck.
No,
But
it's weird. It's terrible. It's worth mentioning. I think that the writer's strike was happening when this was sort of being shot and finessed. But I
I
think
don't think that can explain it.
that's not why it's unwatchable to me. Like it's the physical experience of putting my eyes on this thing that makes me hate it.
There are
Uh,
lots of ways in which they edit things into existence that don't need to exist.
hmm,
Like, I feel like they were trying to create a storyline out of offcuts of shoots, and the material they had just didn't substantiate the kind of story they're trying to tell. So there's like a particular bit where Bond is talking to Mathis and his wife, and I think Bond says, "Why would you want to get back on the road with me and leave this life?" And then it sort of cuts to the wife asking to have her back oiled, and then it cuts to Bond downing a shot, and then it's next scene. I
yeah,
think what they're trying to do is suggest that Mathis is so bored of serving his wife that he's willing to get on the road, and they
hmm,
try and make that happen out of material that just doesn't exist.
yeah,
And
yeah,
it just doesn't make any sense when you see it. It's just like literally these half-second shots of a woman frowning, and then Mathis isn't even in shot. Mathis, Bond just downs a shot. You're like, what's that meant to mean? It doesn't mean what you're trying to project onto it.
and obviously, like the actor playing Mathis obviously hadn't been instructed to act it like that
No,
because he doesn't look bored or weary. He looks kind of a bit happy actually to be out of the madness of the action. So there's this the purpose of the scene seems to be completely at cross purposes with what everyone involved in the scene thought was happening. uh, Apparently, that was it's a bad one. It's a bad one,
it is a bad one. Can I just say one last thing about it?
of course.
So like a crowning moment of irritation I have with it, which is that it has quite a poetic end for Dominic Green. He has an inexplicable boss battle with an axe with Bond, and he's a tiny man, and it shouldn't have ever happened. But then, whilst the building is blowing up, it cuts to him crawling outside, just to establish that he somehow managed to get outside. Then cuts back again. Then eventually, Bond picks him up and dumps him in the desert with only a can of motor oil to drink, which is. And Dominic Green says, "Oh, you said you'd let me go," and Bond's like, "Well, I have. Good luck." And that's a cruel and but fitting end to a major villain. But then, like a scene later, it's revealed that he died not only having drunk the motor oil, but having been shot twice, presumably by Spectre agents who bothered to track him down to the middle of a desert. And that just undermines the entire thing. Like, well, you didn't need to kill him twice. Bond had already done it, and in a clever way.
Yeah.
Inexplicable.
What? Why? Yeah, why? Why? That makes no sense. Oh,
Yeah.
ugh. I actually have a physical aversion to that film. I watched it. I watched it yesterday, and still haven't quite recovered from being bludgeoned by
No.
it.
I mean, it's upwards from here,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Well, at least a little bit.
I think so.
Maybe upwards and downwards and upwards. Anyway, Skyfall is the next film, directed by Sam Mendes, who's well known in the theatre world. He's done a lot of really good TV Shakespeare adaptations. He directed American Beauty, which was secretly terrible but won lots of awards. Jarhead, which was secretly just okay, and 1917, which is good action masquerading as somber war fiction. Again, Neil Purvis, Robert Wade get credits, but John Logan is now on the writing cast, and he's known for various films such as Any Given Sunday, Gladiator, The Aviator, and Hugo. So he's worked with lots of big name directors.
Hmm.
And I think importantly, the cinematography is lent by Roger Deakins, who is a staple of the Coen Brothers films. I think he might have done the cinematography for all the Coen Brothers films?
Uh,
Question mark.
I think they have.
He's certainly done a lot of the Sam Mendes films. Cinematographer on The Shawshank Redemption, but a storied cinematographer of who knows how to frame things and make them look dead pretty. Shall I hit you with a synopsis?
Yeah, let's do it.
Bond is missing, presumed dead after a botched operation. However, an attack on MI6 headquarters and a personal threat to M causes him to haul himself out of his boozy torpor to face down a former MI6 agent, Raoul Silva, who was once the 00 golden boy but sacrificed by M to make a deal with the Chinese. Raoul is captured, but it's all part of his brilliant plan to escape immediately and then attempt a very half-hearted assassination on M, which results in Bond and M fleeing to Scotland for a tower defense sequence against Raoul's army of goons. What did you make of this, Tom?
You know what? This one, I actually quite like because, and perhaps solely because, when I think back across all the Craig era, the action sequences that stand out that have lodged themselves in my brain all come from this film, and it's the kind of dirt
Is that
bike.
because it's literally 16 hours long?
It is, and that's about like 17 hours too long as well. Given there's a lot of plot in this though. The dirt bike chase sequence across the roof of the bazaar in Turkey, that is just like lodged in my brain as a fantastic, incredible Bond action scene moment, and that transitions into another like absolutely absurd sequence where they're on a train fighting. Bond gets into a digger that's on the train, uses the digger to tear the back out of a carriage, and then walks through the train while passengers look alarmed. It's just good. It's very, very good. It's incredibly well shot. Later on, I think there's this beautiful sequence in a building surrounded by a skyscraper surrounded by screens. It's kind of the skyscraper itself seems to be made of glass, so the light of the neon signs reflects throughout the building as Bond sneaks up on an assassin and has this incredible fight with him, which is where they're both just like pitch black silhouettes against this blazing neon advertising happening behind them. And the scene is just like, it's very well choreographed, but also, and thank God for this after watching the last film, the camera just sits still and slowly pans in on these guys having this desperate fight with a gun that they're trying to it's kind of like a sniper rifle that they're exchanging hands and trying to shoot each other with it as they're fighting, having this martial arts fight. And it's just virtuoso stuff. It's absolutely beautiful, and that lodges in my mind. And then towards the end, the tower defense sequence in the Highlands, also just like there are moments of that are just really, really super cool. But I would say, anyone listening to this who enjoyed that sequence or the idea of that sequence, watch episode 5 of Gangs of London.
Oh yes,
because for me, the director of The Raid directs that episode, and I can't imagine, there has to be a connection between Skyfall and that scene. Like, I have to think that he must have seen that and be like, no, I think I'd do it this way actually, and then actually got to do it in Gangs of London.
Yeah,
and it's a 40-minute siege sequence that is one of the best action sequences I've seen. Just full stop, and it's in television series. Just this prolonged siege where there are these kind of like special forces trying to get into this kind of mansion or a kind of a farmhouse from many different angles. As beleaguered people inside have these desperate floor fights, and it's almost wordless. And I think you could watch it not knowing who any of the characters are, and be invested and surprised and shocked by how it plays out over the course of the best part of an hour, if I remember rightly. Extraordinary stuff. So watching it back again, the Skyfall's kind of tower defense sequence feels like a pale imitation of a thing I've seen absolutely nailed, basically. But the rest of the sequences and the way the film's shot generally is just is beautiful. Like, it's a really beautiful film. And for that, just on a pure aesthetic level, I think it is one of the best of the series, actually, which does raise it up in my estimations. Though it also does have some problems. I wonder what you think.
Well, I think it's definitely a film of many excellent parts, and I don't think the sum of them really works for me. But I do think action scenes in stairwells or on trains are always the best.
Yeah, that's true. That is true.
And I think, and the series has several, and they're always really good. And it's because the filmmakers have to contend with the constraints of that location. And as a result, the audience sees them too, and they empathize with the
Yeah.
characters who are obviously dealing with the physical constraints of those locations. That's why they're really, really good. I think all of the best action set pieces in this entire series share that. They all have really good constrained locations, which the characters have to think about carefully and use in different ways. And this film's good for that. I think the cinematography lends it a particular kind of coherence, but it's also, I would say, watching it now, like I wonder if this is a difference between seeing it on the big screen
Mm,
and seeing it on the small screen. When I first saw it, and certainly it's a relief after the nonsense of the previous film, but when I first saw it, I felt like there's kind of epicness to the way in which the camera chooses to capture things. There's lots of establishing shots. It takes a great deal of care and time to show you the locations in which things are happening and where all the different people are within it. Watching it now, I felt like, because the film is incredibly fucking long anyway,
mm. God, it
and I
is.
don't know that it's long to any particular good end. Like those films, perhaps because they were robbed a bit of their grandeur by watching them on the small screen, just felt more like padding than they were worth this time around. Did you kind of see a difference in the way that you viewed it, watching it on small screen versus in the cinema this time?
Yeah, absolutely. I've found this with all the films actually, and this is one of the series where the Bond films in particular, I think, are very, very different if you see them on the big screen compared to the small screen. I think that this point can be kind of overplayed in criticism. Is that this simply has to be seen on the big screen? It's a different experience. You'll interpret it differently. But I think it is true for these films because the those beautiful action scenes and those incredible moments kind of blot out the noise of the plot. And the plot in Bond films is always overcomplicated. It's this yammering, incessant shuffling of a pack of kind of goons and amazing travel to loads of different places instantly, often for no reason, keeping track of loads of names. It's kind of like a bait and switch. If it's too complicated, then you don't have a chance to really particularly think about it in the cinema and poke holes in it. So what it does is the actual plotting puts you into the sense of kind of like, uh, this assumed sense that something complicated and interesting is happening.
Right,
uh,
yeah. It's about the aesthetic of complication rather than the actual complication.
Rather than if you were to think about it and kind of really unpack what people's relationships are, how everyone's betraying everyone else, what that means emotionally, blah blah blah. There's no time to do that. Like there's a what's the there's been a mega successful kind of cop drama about internal affairs in Britain.
Line of Duty.
Line of Duty. Line of Duty does
Mm.
this. What Line of Duty does is, instead of like crafting a watertight plot that like pushes its characters through some sort of emotional arc that creates these emotional moments, is it creates noise. It just creates loads and loads of noise, loads of characters, loads of people you have to remember, loads of kind of like twists and turns, and people betraying each other. Occasionally, very well shot action sequences, and you're left with the impression of a thriller
Mm.
with
Yeah.
none of the actual kind of mechanical substance of a thriller. And that's what Skyfall is like to me, because when I was in the cinema, it's almost like a texture thing. That these action sequences are very loud and there's a lot going on, but they're kind of um, they're gripping, and then when they cease, something equally gripping but of a different texture needs to occupy the space. And I think the plotting in this film basically serves that role. Like all of the him wanting to be captured, and then that having this weird thing with M, and then having Bond discovering his family lineage for some reason, just because that's I guess a thing that might affect a character. So here it is. All so
Yeah.
you go out of all this kind of visual noise and into this plot noise, and I wonder if it's actually intentional. I wonder like whether these plots are just overcomplicated as a kind of pacifying mechanism to get you through the film to the end, um,
Might
rather
be
than
cheaper
actually.
if it didn't, I think. I suspect it's not intentional. I don't think the languorousness and the kind of convolution of it is necessarily. I don't think the effect that those things have is intentional. Like
I don't think
I
so
have a
either.
feeling that Mendes thinks that he's being brilliantly discursive about the nature of Bond, and he's talking about and investigating the iconography and meaning of Bond. But I think a lot of it is quite shallow and fluffy, and I don't know. There's a sort of I really enjoy the set pieces, like I said, but I found it over watching it this time pretty leaden to watch, and I don't think it's as smart as it thinks it is, or perhaps, like you say, it doesn't need to be that smart because it's just about having the air of smartness. But it definitely has this unearned austerity to it, in that it sort of alludes to these sort of grim realities of global politics and the security state, but it doesn't really have anything to say about them. It's just a little bit miserable,
Yeah.
and I don't know. There's a sort of kind of brazenly discursive aspect to it, which I find slightly vexing. Whereas, you know, Casino Royale has loads of things to say about Bond, right? But it says them in its actions and in its themes. Whereas in Mendes films, you'll literally get a character after a character just openly wanging on about what it means to be a Bond in today's bleak world. And, it'll say something like, were you expecting an exploding pen? We don't really go in for that anymore. And
Mm.
it's just a little bit kind of, I know that stuff should have been saved for the essays about the film and not put in the film itself, I think.
It's precious time, isn't it? It's precious time
Mm.
of your life you're never getting back when you hear the speech about the nature of Bond in the modern world in a film that is appallingly long for what it's trying to do.
Mm.
And I don't know. It feels like films increasingly, just action films, are getting so long. Action films are the hardest things to watch for a long time because
Mm.
they take a lot of energy to watch. Actually, it can become almost stressful to be assaulted by action sequences and then have to keep up with the plot for 3 hours. This one isn't 3 hours, but it feels like it. Um, yeah, I
I tell
kind
you
of.
what,
Sorry, Karen.
I tell you what, it's really weird to me that in a major franchise like this, in the third of those films, that it feels like it's already trying to draw a curtain on Craig as Bond. Like he's clapped out, he's tired, he's cynical,
Oh yeah, yeah.
and like he isn't even onto Spectre's tail yet. And yet, like the majority of the films in this series are all about how old and tired he is and how he doesn't want to do it anymore. And like that does impart a level of exhaustion to the viewer,
Mm.
because everything in the film, from Craig's tired face to the sad things he's saying as a sad shooty man, is that he doesn't want to be doing it anymore and nobody wants to be here. Like I can't help but feel a bit wearied by like that. Like if nobody in the film seems to be having fun, and I'm certainly not either. I don't know, and without any kind of real structure to it, like no focus, no single sort of crime, it just feels like this kind of slightly miserable breadcrumb trail. And I
Oh,
don't feel like the breadcrumbs are all that convincing, or they're not that interesting. Like as a stolen list of agents again, which is
that's the noise.
which
That's the plot noise.
yeah.
Yeah. It's this
But
being yeah. Hmm.
spies have been fighting over lists of secret agents in films forever, including at least four of the Mission Impossible films. It seems. So and it's fine, but spy's only job. If spy's only job is protecting lists of spies, then the issue could be solved by simply not having spies, I would think. Do you find the whole mummy issues thing interesting?
uh, I thought it was kind of a garish way to make a villain interesting.
Oh,
uh,
I was thinking about Bond and M's relationship as much as
oh well,
Bardem's. Yeah, yeah.
no, I like that they hate each other a little bit in the first film. I'll go back for that actually because like a kind of puerile and undeveloped, emotionally stunted man like Bond might just identify M as mother,
Hmm.
as Roll does. Like maybe he does, but I don't think the film's saying that. I think
Well,
I think that
yeah.
perhaps it's saying that Bond can only care about women on certain axes. One axis is have sex and then they die axis, and the other one is uh, oh my god, a person who reflects he's adopted right as a character. Like that's
Yeah.
a point the film's about. So the mother figure and the father figure are obviously going to be sore points as drama demands. But I don't. I think it was intelligently explored. I think it was just sort of there. It's like the adoption stuff and the family stuff that pops up, and the reason why he goes to Scotland for the big tower defense thing.
Mm.
It's just there. I don't think it says anything about the character. It's not part of the rhythm of the film, and not. I don't think it says anything.
When Bond turns up at M's flat, as he often does throughout the series,
Mm.
um, and he's been out of the service, he's been presumed dead, and he turns up, and he says, "Oh, I'll go downstairs and change," and then M says, "No, I've sold your flat." That sort of implies that they used to live above each other, which would
Oh,
make great
what?
sense
Whoa,
as
what?
a sitcom. I think upstairs, downstairs sort of
What?
drama.
What a
It's
weird line.
yeah, I don't know quite what that whole thing is in trying to imply, but it's kind of odd. I
I
don't know.
think
How do you feel about Javier Bardem as Raul Silva? His performance, I
uh,
find it quite mesmerizing, but I also think it might be very homophobic. It's hard to know.
yeah, I was wondering yeah. There's, there's a scene that, like, might have always almost been challenging where, he basically, Bond's tied to a chair, and he advances across the room doing his big villain speech, and then basically just starts touching Bond, and they have this kind of back and forth, and it's kind of there is strong gay threat vibes to it that I'm not sure they were really going for with this guy. Like, I think the sexual policies of Bond would be made more interesting by the fact Bond will happily use men, women, anyone that he can use to get the job done and to get what he wants. That is very much in character for Bond. Um, but I don't think this was exploring that. I think this was like, uh oh, Bond's being touched by a man. Oh no, this is part of what makes him a menace, which is a don't fall on the wrong side of that line. It's not cool.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, they sort of try and get out of that by him saying, "I suppose you've never been touched like this
Right.
before," or something, and James Bond saying, "How do you know I haven't?"
Yeah, right.
Implying that he's had gay relationships as well. But it's just not quite enough to undo the fact that this is being presented as a creepy gay predator.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, that's the vibe. Yeah.
yeah.
Again, you got to do that stuff intelligently. Potentially a good moment, like potentially like a
Mm,
really interesting moment for the character. And it's just like having this is this goes hand in hand with like the Bond villain is an established cultural archetype now, and what a Bond villain is, they tend to have some sort of disfigurement. Which,
mm,
they tend to be psychopaths, but also very showy psychopaths that tend to make speeches, and they tend to be larger than life in a way that is kind of kind of entertaining, perhaps sometimes even funny. And with that, all those prerequisites in place, when you slot a character into the Bond villain role, if one of those factors also he likes men, and playing with that,
mm.
like you got to think about the context of the Bond villain and what that is, and how weirdness and this concept of weirdness, which often is communicated through disfigurement, through disability, and stuff like that, in really uncomfortable ways. Then sort of like, oh, let's just map homosexuality onto that as well. Let's just make that part of the kind of Bond villain archetype. Oh, you kind of just don't really, unless you know what you're doing. Don't please, actually.
Yeah.
Well, am I on point? Do you think like
Oh yeah, no, I'm totally with you. I think it's a very off-color moment, really. I can see that they were trying to go for something interesting by suggesting that it wasn't as alarming to Bond as it's being presented as. But I just before we move on, I'd like to pay homage to real proper actor Rory Kinnear having to say things like "strip the headers, trace the source," and "it was sent by an asymmetrical security algorithm."
poor man shut in
Yeah.
this room, surrounded by CGI tables that everyone has to touch because Minority Report happened. So then, after Minority Report was shot, every flipping film had to have this in.
Yeah,
Poor
the
people.
UIs don't make any sense.
No, no. It's this thing of like where someone there's a table which is also a screen. They fling a thing off to the side of the table and it pops up on a random window. It's like what? What are you like? Desperate to make data analysis look interesting visually. Trying a bit too hard. Good
I just
shout
I
out though.
do I do like the way that Raoul Silver dies. I think aside
Mm,
from the dubious aspects of his characterization, I think it is like an interesting performance from Javier Bardem. And like specifically after he gets the knife in the back, his the kind of expression as he dies is great
Irritated.
because
So
he
good.
doesn't care about dying; he just cares about being beaten, and he's so annoyed at
He's-
it.
let's have this exasperated gasp, even as he
Yeah.
does this kind of zombie like walk towards Bond and then flops down in actually like a very like almost too comical way. Uh,
Mm.
it's also like I read that as him wanting his theatrical death, like closing in on M, and like he's kind of crafted this big kind of plot in his mind about how his
Mm.
life and his death was going to play out, and he was going to all his delicious machinations were going to lead to his perfect exit from the stage, and that a gorilla in a suit threw a knife in his back at the very moment where he was about to get that. His reaction is just like, "No, Pete, why?" It's very good. And also, yeah, shout out to Judi Dench for nailing that role completely throughout the whole series. Even though, what were they going for with them? Now you've said that the thing about like Bond and M being his mum dynamic, I kind of like hadn't thought about that very much, and now I'm a bit weirded out by it. Time for another rewatch.
Well, I mean, family becomes important in the next film.
Mm.
Spectre, again, Sam Mendes, returning screenplay writers, plus Jez Butterworth, who is known from the theatre for apparently an amazing play production. All my friends loved it. I never quite got to see it, called Jerusalem, which I'd really like to see. He also has writing credits on Edge of Tomorrow and Ford v Ferrari, which was surprisingly good despite being about cars. And also, apparently, he's going to be part of the writing crew for the untitled fifth Indiana Jones film.
Oh.
Different cinematographer this time. Hoyt van Hoytema, who is known for, amongst other things, his Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy and Dunkirk and other Nolan films. It's sort of hard to synopsize Spectre because it really isn't about anything. It's just a series of things that happen in exhausting succession.
It's a nothing film to me. It's almost like I couldn't rate the film because it's a 0 in my brain.
I mean,
Like,
if you told me that the writer's strike disrupted this one, that would be a lot more believable to me. But it begins. So Bond is on thin ice after he does an unsanctioned mission in Mexico. He blows up a building, throws some people out of a helicopter who questionably didn't need to be thrown out of a helicopter, like the pilot. Well, the pilot hasn't done anything. He's just probably just been chartered. Goes straight out the window. Anyway, MI6 is under fire from another Whitehall Mandarin who seeks to create a unified global surveillance network and shut down the 00 program. So M grounds Bond for his own good, but Bond has no intention of staying put. And it's revealed he's following a lead in a posthumous message from the old M, Dench M. He follows this lead to Italy, where he sexually assaults a widow and locates a shadowy cabal, meeting under the leadership of someone from James's past. And unbelievably, it takes literally over an hour before we find out who that is, what the name he pulls out of thin air means. During which time, Bond has located an old enemy in the form of Mr. White, and who's now dying from radiation poisoning. And he promises to give Bond some information if Bond protects his hot daughter. The information isn't particularly of any significance, but nonetheless, Bond finds the daughter in her psychiatry practice and then takes her to bed and then to Morocco. And then Bond's nemesis is revealed to be his estranged brother by adoption, who is thought dead in an avalanche which killed Bond's adopted parents. But now he's returned as none other than Stavro Blofeld, and he has engineered not only the avalanche which killed Bond's adopted parents, but also everything in the preceding films. Then a telescope explodes again, and Bond and Mr. White's daughter end up back in London, where people are repeatedly kidnapped, escape, and are re-kidnapped until MI5 literally explodes. I feel like this has all of the problems of Skyfall, but worse. Do you feel?
I completely agree. This is almost my least favorite one.
Yeah, it's
Is
close,
that
isn't
it's
it?
that close? It's that close, and it like given how I described Quantum of Solace as being almost like a physical assault on my person. This is kind of like this is too much. to ask of any audience member to suffer through such convoluted horseshit for so long, and to actually not be particularly rewarded by any memorable action sequences or anything, and for it to be actually a very dreary, plodding film,
Mm.
despite the sheer amount of plot they put in it. Like, ah,
Yeah. It
it's,
feels like
it's
it has a lot
almost
to say about Bond, but none of it is interesting. Like
it's almost the one I hate the most. So
it
close.
might actually be the one I hate the most. It's really hard to call.
Mm,
Like I find that like Quantum of Solace is just an objectively poorly made film, I
mm,
think.
yeah.
Whereas this one is actually offensive, I think, in its objectives. Like I think it's too stupid to be a spy film, and it's too slow to be an action film.
Mm.
And actually, I do think it does have some really good moments. One of which is on a train, unsurprisingly,
Aha.
with Big Dave Fingernails, played by
Dave
Dave
Bautista.
Bautista.
Yeah.
And again, it's really good because the constraints of just being basically a two-dimensional fight means
Mm,
that they have to kind of really consider what things they are doing, what walls are being, punctured by falling bodies. And this kind of like, it becomes explicatory in its composition. And it's really good. And then it's ruined by the addition of him saying, "Oh, shit," in an Italian accent before being yoinked off the train. Um, but yeah,
I feel weirdly protective of Dave Bautista,
I
'cause
like
he's
I like him. Yeah.
I think it always makes me weirdly happy to see him in a film beating someone
Yeah.
up. It's like, good for you, Dave Bautista. Good for you. I'm sorry they made you say that terrible line, but you did the rest of it splendidly, and also you're pretty good in the start of Blade Runner 2042 as well.
Oh, he looks so good in a suit as well.
Yeah.
Christ.
Surprisingly, how does such a big man wear a suit like that? I don't know.
Mhm.
I'm impressed.
Tailoring that we will never be able to afford, Tom.
No, that's right, that's right. That's the
Also a
secret.
body that we will never achieve. But I think like the big weakness of this film is Blofeld,
Mm,
surprisingly, and like because he is meant to be the arch villain of Bond forever, and
yeah,
also
yeah.
this sequence of Bond films. And yeah, and it isn't to say anything about Christopher Waltz's performance, which I think is fine. It's just that the film gives him no substance as a villain, except that he is inexplicably has this pointless personal connection to Bond, which feels so tortuous and
Mm,
implausible and retconned. Doesn't feel necessary that they had to put it in. It feels like, we need to say something about Bond. Let's go back and mine his, family connections again. That'll make it really personal. And like, no, by making it personal, it completely undermines the idea of this person being a global threat. He's meant to be the leader of this global shadowy cabal,
yeah.
and his entire raison d'etre is just to piss on Bond's chips. He's like, "It was all me, James," and you're like, "Really? You engineered De Silva's mummy issues? I don't think you did. That's so confected. It's so weak." And on top of that, he is so easily thwarted again and again. Like, there's no way this guy could run a shadowy global cabal. None of his plans are even the slightest bit successful. It's just like, and even when it promises to be interesting, like Blofeld promises to do something to Bond which will really throw a spanner in the works, Bond just effortlessly gets out of it. Like Bond literally has part of his brain drilled out, which allows him to recognize faces. And you think, wow, okay, this is going to make the next bit really interesting, where he can't tell who's who. And
Mm,
what happens is Bond just gets up and he's fine, and he shoots a few people, steals a helicopter, and the telescope explodes again. And you're like, oh well. And then Blofeld's big move is to put Bond in a situation where he can either save Madeline and die, or try to save Madeline and die with her, or he can walk away knowing that he abandoned her. And that setup is really explicitly laid out.
mm,
And Bond just goes and straight up saves her straight away, and like not even with any difficulty by Bond standards. And like, I know obviously the nature of these things demand that Bond thwarts these plans,
mm.
but it's just so straightforward. Blofeld's like, "You'll never do this," and then Bond just does it. It's just like, oh, okay. And the problem with all this is it makes that Blofeld to be an absolute fucking tool,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know,
yeah.
and not an arch villain.
Yeah, I didn't find the performance particularly inspiring either. Just like,
He
to be
just doesn't
honest,
have much to do.
yeah, like what do you do? I suppose. The thing is about doing that, it kind of it makes everything in the universe about James Bond,
Mm,
and when you do that, everything that happens in the universe validates James Bond as a hero. So like every move he makes, it's what we talked about earlier in the kind of the sense that Casino Royale, he is kind of unmoored from the film isn't propping up his moral stance or making him a moral figure in any way. But when the universe bends towards a character so powerfully, um, you can only be expected to think that this character exists to be validated in everything they do in a film like
Right.
this. And then once you're in that position as an audience member, you're expected to buy into every person, like every action that he does. And this is what makes it like Bond in hero framing is super problematic because it potentially normalizes terrible behavior. Bond
Mm.
in Casino Royale mode, as being as Fleming, I think, probably intended, certainly intended for him to be this amoral, difficult figure who is a terrible person but necessary and useful to the state in certain ways. That's that we're past the point of at this point where we've flipped now
Yeah,
from
he's a complete white knight
yeah,
now.
we've flipped from the Casino Royale mode to the hero mode completely, and thoughtlessly, and it's for it to also be so boring at the same time, it's unforgivable.
What's annoying about the flip to white knight status is that there's a whole thing in this about you know whether the double O program needs oversight, and like Mendez spends a lot of fucking time on this, both in Skyfall and this film,
Mhm.
and all it comes down to is oh, if only there wasn't all this inconvenient oversight stopping our bally brilliant boys doing what the fuck they like, and like that question of whether the double O program needs oversight would have more bite if Bond wasn't a perfect white knight. If
Yeah.
if you got to question Bond's moral compass, I mean, okay, outside the many infrequent sexual assaults he commits during the
Mhm.
course of these films. In one case against a grieving widow who literally needs him to survive, which seems the most unforgivable.
Mm.
But like all of that, the tenor of the film sort of gives that stuff the thumbs up, or at least doesn't question it. But the entire debate about whether the double O's need to be kept on a leash has no real grounding in real issues, which is sort of like fine, but like why even bother to raise them at length then?
Mm.
Because it just means the films have this sort of feeling of grim sobriety, but no conviction or interest in untangling these real issues.
Yeah.
Also, C obviously stands for cunt. Say it, you cowards. Say it. What a waste of time.
Well, after this discussion, it's now my least favorite. We'll see.
Yeah,
We'll
I'm
see.
gonna.
I think we'll rank them at the end, but
Yeah.
we'll see.
So on to the final of these
Mm.
films, No Time to Die, now directed by Kari Joji Fukunaga, who is known for, amongst other things, as Sin Nombre, Jane Eyre. He wrote part of the reboot of It, um, and he also directed at least some of True Detective season 1.
Nice.
Screenplay again, Neil Purvis and Robert Wade latch onto it like writing limpets and still get their credit. But Joji Fukunaga seems to also be on the screenplay as a writer, and as does Phoebe Waller-Bridge, who you will know from Fleabag, Killing Eve, and also, along with Jez Butterworth, writing the untitled fifth Indiana Jones film.
What? That film's going to be wild.
Yeah, it's so Bond's retirement at the end of Spectre, with Madeline, who is the daughter, the lovely daughter of Mr. White. It's short lived. There's an attempted assassination attempt on Bond, which leads Bond to believe that Madeline betrayed him, and so he ditches her and returns to the line of duty. And then it cuts 5 years later. A bioweapon is stolen by Spectre agents, operating apparently on Blofeld's instruction, thanks to a bionic eye that allows him to issue instructions from Belmarsh prison. But this weapon is turned against Spectre by a mysterious new entity. Could this entity be connected to the creepy mask-wearing man who attempts to kill and then rescues a young Madeline Swan in the pre-credit sequence? You bet it can. I thoroughly enjoyed this one, less for the premise and the plot, which I think is kind of ludicrous, and also Hughes quite close to Mendez's sort of mythologizing, self-discursive, boring Bond. But it kind of rescues itself by managing to be like really compelling, scene by scene, expertly constructed action. And despite being 20 minutes longer than Skyfall Spectre, it feels really snappy
It
by comparison. How did you feel about it?
this one flashed by in the cinema. I was just like just relentlessly entertained by it, which is it's basically all I want a film to do if I pay for a ticket to go see an action film, and a Bond film in particular. I don't want it to drag, and it'd be funny to play with Bond as an archetype, but I don't necessarily want to be dragged into views on the oversight of British intelligence's, extracurricular uh, organisations. Just please leave me alone with Bond doing a cool thing sometimes, and having it beautifully shot and just expertly rendered. And you really feel like the money in this film has been well spent in terms of when it wants to achieve the spectacle it wants to do. There's fun kind of there's it's kind of like a banter film. It reminds me a bit like a Marvel banter film almost. It's one of the good things for James Bond to pick up from the Marvel films, perhaps, is that having two characters who are thrown together have a fun banter fight in the middle of a real fight is a good way to deliver vicious action while also keeping it light a little bit. And this film keeps it light until the end, which apparently was pretty affected a lot of people. The ending, like, it is.
Hmm.
I thought found it really landed for me in the cinema.
Yeah, actually, yeah. I mean, the whole, yeah. Oh, we'll get to it. But
Yeah, yeah,
I tell you what, actually, talking about keeping it light, I think one of the startling things about it is how the pre-credit sequence slews so close to like unhinged slasher horror,
that's true.
actually.
Actually, yeah, no, that's a good point.
And I think it's really interesting because obviously this film has been handed this massive tedious weight of dealing with the Mendez
Yeah,
Bond and his
yeah.
backstory and tying some sort of bow on it. But it's actually a lot less rote and a lot less referential in the way it sort of recycles. I've written bore iconography down here in my notes, so I meant Bond. But you can really see that in the pre-credit sequence, because every other Bond film reserves this for like an in media res action spectacle with Bond at the center, and here that's completely discarded for describing what terrible thing happens to this little girl,
Mm,
and
mm,
it's genuinely quite scary. I think
it is.
like proper horror beats, face at the window jump scares,
Mm,
and yeah, I mean, you can tell that the director had a hand in the It remake. I think from that.
mm. Yeah, and it's this horrible thing of like it just it throws you to this domestic situation that's really awful as well. Like her,
Mm.
the kid's mum is kind of drunk out of her brain on the sofa, and even in the moment where the assassin comes to kill her, just has no urge to defend herself whatsoever, and it's basically just yeah, fine. And for the daughter to witness all that and then be chased onto the ice by this mask wearing, it's a monstrous thing. Actually, it is.
Mm.
I forgot how dark that was. Actually,
But then he saves her, and that sets up a really
yeah,
interesting
yeah.
relationship. I think, which I don't think is quite as well as explored as it might be. But I mean, it's a very long film anyway, so probably best that it didn't get into that stuff.
Yeah, yeah, that's true.
But I tell you, the thing that I love about this film is that all of the action is incredibly thoughtfully rooted in the space in which it is presented.
Mhm.
Like Bond is always rapidly solving the puzzle of the environment and how to put that space to use effectively. And because it's so explanatory about that, it puts you right there making those decisions with him. And like in the early section in Italy, just after the attempted assassination, he's trying to make it back from this church across this
Oh,
ravine
yeah.
with this huge bridge to a place with a piazza and the hotel, and that they use that environment multiple times. Like Bond's on foot at first, and then uses like part of the cabling on the side of the bridge to swing underneath it. Then there's a bit on a bike where he ramps up like a piece of masonry. Then he goes through the same area and again in a car. And like each time he's like traversing it differently and
Mm.
thinking about it in a different way. And it's really brilliant. I think it's a really good way of kind of rooting you in it and making you care about it. And I think it's testament to how successful those sequences are that the film sort of loses its way when it moves to the heavily composited, missile silo poison base at the
Yeah,
end.
yeah.
Even though there is a great stairwell fight, doesn't have a
God,
train fight in this, but it's got a
gotta have
stairwell.
it. You gotta have it.
Um, but it doesn't know how to use, like, that's because that's a real physical space. It doesn't know how to use the kind of imagined spaces, the larger imagined spaces. But then everything else, like from that pre-credit lake house, there's a bar in Cuba, which is really kind of I could draw you the map of that bar. That's how well thought
Mm.
out it is. And there's a chase in the misty forest, which, obviously that environment is unknown by virtue of being misty, but like Bond is still thinking about what makes that place unique and how he can exploit it. And that's so thrilling. And it sort of like really enhances your connection to the scene and the characters and the stakes.
I also think I don't think he does anything explicitly magical in this film, which he does often. He just has
Mm.
superpowers at random points in lots of the films, and like he has gadgets and he has a bulletproof car that has Gatling guns in it. Uh,
Yeah.
and sure, that almost broke the film for me immediately when, but it was fine. Like it worked out okay. But I don't think he does anything like particularly superhuman by the standards set by the rest of the films.
Does he have a smart blood in this one? I think that was introduced in the previous one. Every time they said the word smart blood, I got like 10% stupider. I can't
Oh,
remember which film that's in.
this might turn into the villainous threat of this one, which is torn from the headlines idea of genetic
Mm.
nanobot attack.
Mm.
Uh,
I think that's
hmm.
a really interesting
It's a real
weapon.
thing. Like it's a real thing
Yeah.
because like actually like tailored viruses, genetically tailored viruses, is a thing that like it's also a terrifying thing. More importantly, as a device, it's something you kind of understand so that you tailor a virus, or in this case, like a nanobot attack, to someone's particular genetic identity, and then touch them, and then they will die, just untraceably die. That's a really good thing you want to stop as a villain. If a villain is doing this in a Bond film, yeah, Bond, cool, go stop that thing. It's actually a good. The stakes are good in this film.
Right, but it's also, I mean, Safin uses it first to kill Spectre, who are
Mm,
absolutely evil. And so
yeah,
there is
yeah,
a kind of element where there is a sort of trolley problem
yeah.
issue with this weapon where, maybe he does indeed intend to use it to wipe out dictators and evildoers and do the world a favor in a way.
Hmm.
But obviously, doing so unilaterally and positioning himself as like judge and executioner is completely unconscionable. But
But
the
then,
film doesn't really get into that, but it does play with the idea that he might be more of a sympathetic figure because
yeah,
you first see him, saving a little girl, having tried to kill her, admittedly, but then does wipe out the arch nemesis. And I would say, if Blofeld doesn't serve any real purpose in this series at all, he does do well in his demise, I think, because uh, I mean, it's a great scene where Bond has been smeared in this poison juice that's coded specifically to Blofeld's DNA.
mhm,
Bond doesn't know it, but we know it as the audience that if he touches Blofeld, Blofeld's going to die.
yeah.
And you're in this interrogation scene. The camera doesn't do anything so crude as to cut directly to like a close up of Bond's hands, but you're so aware of
Yeah,
where they are at
yeah,
all
that's really true.
times.
Yeah, and Blofeld's in this amazing kind of Hannibal Lecter times 10 type prison situation
Yeah.
where he's like locked to a chair that has to come down a train track or something, which is also just this film is like compared to the rest of the films, it is um, I don't know if camp is the right word. Very showy,
Mm,
and very earnestly happy to be a bit silly with its imagery in order to basically get the message across quickly. Is that uh, I think everyone like the Hannibal Lecter idea. I think is just ingrained to this point where if you see someone locked in a cell like that, it's been repeated by so many films that you get the idea that this is an untouchable maniac who's incredibly dangerous. So they use that visual language to encase Blofeld in various layers of perspex, and then having this moment where the face-to-face moment, Hannibal Lecter moment, with Clarice replicated in a James Bond situation is kind of fun. It's just fun.
mm.
But this film's really fun, which is kind of like a very generic. It's not really a particularly good way to criticize a film to say it's fun, but as an experience to go to the cinema and be entertained by it and amused by it, even
Mm.
while you're invested in the stakes, is actually it's not hard to achieve, and it's a note that none of the rest of the films quite achieve.
Right.
And even like it would be inappropriate for Casino Royale to go for that because it's a different film about different stuff, try to achieve a different tone. But for this to be so playful, but without being too pretentious or wanky about it, was refreshing and nice. I liked it.
Yeah. I mean, I even like Bond becoming a father. Like,
Hmm.
I mean, if you'd said that was the plot of another Mendes film, I would probably not have bothered to even watch it. And I'm not sure that's ever what I wanted from this Bond, who, like, since the second film has just has been desperate to stop being Bond in quite a drab way.
Mm,
Like having a child is just another thing in a long line of things that's made Bond want to quit. But I think it's handled really well. Like his final sacrifice is also handled well with like explicit finality.
yeah,
And I don't know that the whole arc that he's on from like eager killer to noble knight. I think that's really a journey into a much more banal and uncomplicated kind of heroism than was promised in Casino Royale.
yeah,
But like the crime of instigating that arc falls on others' shoulders. So
definitely.
having been handed Bond in this state on this trajectory, I think the resolution they give is a credit to the filmmakers. Although everybody toasting him afterwards is a little bit sentimental, I thought.
Yeah, has to be said. But I thought you were right when you said like this film comes with so much baggage, and for it to sort of so ably bin it off, and
Yeah.
then run ultimately a story about a dad who finds out he wants to protect his daughter, and then ends up it clarifies his priorities and then makes a sacrifice at the end, and also
Mm.
but without this idea that he's so old, his body is failing, he's failed his test to be in MI6. Oh, he's a rogue agent. He's on without any of those devices, just to make it a film about Bond discovering something that he might want to live for and then having to die for it. That's a very old kind of plot device, but it's effective. And
Mm.
if you can just like dump all of the bullshit for the rest of the series and just nail that point, well done. And also to deliver all the action scenes that you expect, the level that you expect from a Bond
Mm.
franchise. For all that's just happened in 2 hours. Very happy with it. Really, really enjoyed it.
I think a lot of that credit, uh, the sort of grounding of his relationship and his role of father is actually credit to Leia Sadu, who
Yeah, yeah.
really has a bit of a nothingy character on paper, but her performance of it gives it a real kind of depth, I think, and complexity, which isn't necessarily there in the kind of structure of it or the writing of it.
Mm. Yeah, yeah.
Also, I mean, like, I don't feel that these films really do a good job of assembling like an ensemble around Bond. Like, they try in this film to sort of get the gang back together, but like, I like the individual kind of brief performances, like Ben Whishaw as Q,
Yeah, I really like
etc.
him as
But
Q. Mm.
but I don't know that they have enough to make them feel like I care about them as a gang of people. I like
Mm.
I like Jeffrey Wright a lot. Actually, I think he does enough in these films to for you to mourn his passing as a character, and for you to feel suitably vengeful towards Ash, that little impish faced CIA agent.
I was really hoping that Ralph Fiennes would get to do more as M,
Mm.
instead of B, just an incredibly nagging presence in. I think is it Spectre where you. So he comes in at the end of Skyfall, I think, and then in Spectre he just sort of berates Bond and is irritated by him, but without any of the kind of relationship that he had with Judi Dench's version of M.
What's weird is it's like a reversion to type because
Right.
M's of old and
Yeah,
like
yeah.
every.
They're the bureaucrat, right? Yeah.
Well, yeah, but it's also the sort of like the head of the precinct role in any film where a cop is, you know,
Oh, it's ready and
you don't
close.
do it by the book, but goddamn, you're a good cop, kind of thing.
Mm.
And he sort of falls into that role, whereas Dench was really breaking from that
Yeah,
mold,
yeah.
and it's sort of weird. I like Ralph Fiennes as a presence, but I don't think they find something interesting for his character to do. Really,
No.
I also like Anna de Armas as Paloma in this. I think that
Mm.
character is great fun. Very briefly introduced, but good. What do you think of like Nomi? I think is the name of the character, the new 007.
I thought it was the way it was played was, to me, painfully tokenistic.
Mm.
Uh, in a way that I think like, it's in a context where uh, there's a certain discourse among certain people of political persuasion that says that male role models are being replaced by women, and that leaves men with nothing to believe in. Um, and this came to a crescendo around Doctor Who moving to having a woman play the Doctor, which is like I can't even understand why that would be a problem. But then uh, it's a kind of like straw man argument that like, what if Bond was eventually ever cast and played by a woman? how can we destroy this bastion of morality that young men have been bending towards, like flowers towards the sun? How can we burn this down? What will men will be left with? They will become criminals. They will become Blofeld. Um, and I think perhaps by accident, her character kind of tried to perhaps play with that, but also just kind of bought into it a little bit by doing so. You always give that narrative too much credence by casting someone who, oh, a black woman is in the 007 role. Oh, do you find that threatening? Do you? Do you? Do you? Well, what, why are you asking that question? What? It's not worth asking that question. And also, it's just like, why can't you just have a black woman character on, as a character in the plot on their own terms, rather than having to be a threat to, like a paper threat to this masculine ideal. I think it was done playfully and perhaps with good intent, but I found it to be I found it to be a bit of a token move, to be honest.
Yeah, I wasn't quite sure what to make of it because I mean, I remember the dialogue around the time of Moneypenny. She's introduced in Skyfall, and and there was a suggestion in that she was going to be that she's being set up to replace Bond, and then it's revealed at the end that she's actually Moneypenny.
Mhm.
And she's going to be benched as a secretary forever,
Right.
and so I feel like this is sort of like a sort of an apology for that, but it's also not substantiated by making Nomi more of a character.
Yeah, and then there's a bit like, halfway through where she goes, "I have come to realize that it's you who is 007 and not I." And
Yeah,
then she just vanishes. It's like, what's the
yeah,
point
and
of
then
all that?
she drinks to him at the end as though he was a good friend. Like, well,
Yeah.
I don't think any of this has been earned, really.
Mm,
Um, but yeah,
not great.
not
But,
great.
that's what I meant, like, when at the very start of the conversation, when it said, like, Bond makes these, like, clumsy, lurching attempts to come back into modernity, and yet all of the tropes that make it successful have to be kept intact, because if Bond becomes unrecognizable to the people who've grown up with Bond, then people will stop going to see those films.
Fuck them, I say. So in summation, give me your ranking. Give me your ranking
Oh,
and tell me what you think overall.
well, Casino Royale's the best. It's the best one. It's just a great film in its own right. I think if you knew nothing about Bond, it's still the most thrilling and intriguing piece of spy fiction that exists in this particular series. Second, I'm torn between No Time to Die and Skyfall because I do like spectacle a lot, and I think experiencing Skyfall in the cinema has had an enduring impact. Um, mm, and then maybe the rest of it could kind of go into the bin. Could you have like a 1-2 bin? Is that a list?
Sure.
I don't know. I'll hear what you
If you
think.
like.
I'd like to. What do you reckon?
Oh, I think we probably have the same sort of instincts. Casino Royale, No Time to Die, Skyfall for me sits quite a lot lower just because although I like parts of it, as a whole, I find it very boring.
Mm.
And then Quantum of Solace, I think now sits in fourth place above Spectre, which I just, yeah, just a real waste of a film and a bad guy and actors and money and everything. I'm like, I feel overall like I feel a bit sorry for Craig, and I think he deserved better films than were eventually delivered on the back of Casino Royale. I feel like Casino Royale is brilliant and he is a good Bond throughout, but
Yeah.
I feel like we got a very muddled sequence of films that ultimately couldn't reconcile the desire to modernize Bond or pay homage to a staid formula. And the films want Bond both as like this anti-hero and they want him to be an agent of a decaying empire, but they also want him to be a warrior, a noble warrior. And, like he's cutting through the red tape to mete out justice. And those two things just don't work together. Like you can't have both. And on top of that, you have this sort of like really awkward and very disparate handling by auteur directors, each of whom sort of tries to wrangle their own vision, but you sense is ultimately defeated by executives who tell them what Bond really is, which is a vehicle for selling luxury watches that make them rich.
Oh
And
yeah.
I just don't think any of the directors really quite managed to make the film theirs, or manage to fit it into a larger design. And so you end up with a series which is like shrinking from Bourne's shadow and seemingly regretting its own existence from the second film onwards, and it's jealous of like the MCU production model, and it's weighed down with like this feeling of superficial portent and like really woeful introspection, which would be a fine thing in a more serious film, but it isn't going to be a serious film, and it's eventually trivialized by like camp and glib insertions. And yet from that sort of that massive mess, they do manage to extract like a really memorable, steely and thuggish and yet sympathetic Bond. I think the series delivers one really great film and one other great action film, and more than a handful of like really memorable set pieces from the rest. And so I think thanks altogether.
How does that stack up to Brosnan's run then? I think it's much better than Brosnan's run. I think at least there are things, sort of ideas bubbling away here that the
Hmm.
Brosnan films. GoldenEye is just the perfect piece of camera entertainment. I think it's fantastically stupid, and I like it a lot. But the rest of those films are pretty bad. I think, like, worse than a lot of these films, but
Yeah, I
shorter.
think
Crucially,
yes. I think the Brosnan films aspire to trivial spectacle,
yeah,
and at
yeah.
their best, they really achieve that. And when they don't, there's no reason to watch them. I think they're just genuinely bad films. Whereas, I don't know whether you can give like credit for effort. But there's a lot of effort that's been spent on the new Bonds, and not always to great effect. But I do love Christina Ryle. I think that was a great idea of what to do with Bond. What would you do with Bond? Who should play Bond next? Let's
Wow.
start there.
Of course, that's the biggest question, isn't it?
I
It's got
know.
to be
I also
someone.
think it's irrelevant, but
Is it? It's relevant, but having said that, like, I do stick by what I said earlier when I said that actually the mannerisms and the way that Bond holds himself, that the physical performance of the actor, kind of does a lot to add depth to the character that the script is never going to give to that character by
yeah.
necessity. For it to be a Bond script, he's never going to say anything beyond a certain scope. So a lot of the nuance is going to have to be delivered by the actor, and also it has to be someone we've probably not heard of. That tends to be it. Like, I don't think anyone really called that Daniel Craig would be pulled up to be Bond. I think in Casino Royale it makes perfect sense. I think he's actually this amazing smouldering presence on the screen in Casino Royale, in a way that he's kind of later becomes just kind of. It's kind of sad that he made such a big point of his age in
Mm.
as a plot point in some of those films, because like he could have probably kept up the Casino Royale persona as new Bond, and I think he delivered that fantastically. But there's someone new, like, I think it does have to be someone quite young, and someone who I the thing is, weirdly my instinct is to go back to a more svelte, playful Brosnan, but with more intelligent writing behind him.
Mm.
Um, and I think it does have to be a man to play Bond, because Bond as a character is so deeply entwined with typical masculine coding that his appeal is also so tied into that if you were to cast a woman as Bond, no one would see it because of all that traditional audience. And yeah, as you say, maybe fuck him and maybe do something else completely. But I think, like, as a project, as a
Mm.
financial project, it would just be a suicide for the series to do so. I think it's interesting to ask why that's the case, and why this male icon, who exists to sell watches, um, is so prized and so central to the series, this global, incredibly popular series, that you cannot abandon the fact that he's a man. Like that's interesting. Why is that so essential to
Mm.
this whole escapade, this whole massive marketing exercise that Bond is? Why is this core idea of masculinity so central to it? But it is. I think if you cast a woman as Bond, the series has to find it. The series ceases to be Bond in the way it currently is, and maybe that's fine. I mean, maybe that's a good thing. But I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I'm sort of with you. I'm with Daniel Craig actually, who's asked this question. He said, uh, no, there's no reason for a woman to play Bond because women should have their own spy movies which are better than Bond. I
Well,
think,
yeah.
I think almost. talent is wasted on Bond, and I get excited by the prospect of thinking about young actors and what they would do in the role. I was excited when Idris Elba's name or
Of
Chiwetel
course.
Ejiofor's name was brought up about it. But wouldn't it be better for them to have their own spy movies, which didn't have the obligation to sell watches and were free from all the sexist, racist, imperialist baggage of
Yeah, right.
Bond?
Yeah.
And like, I think not you can make good Bond films, but everybody involved could make better not Bond films, I
Mm.
think. And there's always this pressure from above, which end up with the franchise getting dragged back into sort of like quippy watch commercial camp
Yeah,
and
it's
uh,
the gravitational pull of just the basic
money.
kind of money, but then the money is there because people buy into this. Like the, the market for these things is just absurd. Like I think I've like in our chats I've described James Bond as Doctor Who for GQ readers,
Yes, that's very good.
and that's it really. It's like you need to have an endlessly regenerating, pretty male face that you can that basically acts as a clothes rack for companies that want to promote their brands, and even if the products they put onto Bond are unattainable to everyone, they will have like a mid range that some people will be able to afford, and they'll make a massive buck on it. And that's I can't think of another character that is quite so materialistic as Bond, as an enduring kind
Mm.
of hero icon that to be so uh, defined by that character's ability to sell pretty things to men. I can't think of another. I can't think of an equivalent really, and that's why a Bond film must be made every 4 to 5 years, and very intelligent, very clever, very talented people be brought in to try and perhaps redefine it. But the gravitational pull at the heart of this whole series remains, and that I enjoy that friction. I enjoy that's why one of the reasons why I always watch them, because I like to see how talented people try to navigate navigate that terrible situation they're getting into. It's not a poison chalice, lots of money involved, but it's a chalice that I'm sure tastes like shit to people who could make much better things.
Should I tell you what I would do with it?
Go on then. Yes, please.
This is going to betray everything you just said because it would be certainly wildly unpopular both with his execs and also fans. But I'd abandon it as a movie project. I would try and make a TV series, um, and I would set it across many decades. And I would start in the 70s, where Bond is a new recruit.
Mm.
But I wouldn't make it specifically about Bond. I think the series would be called Double O or something like that, and it would be
Ooh.
like a real ensemble thing with Bond initially as a linchpin, but often a figure in the background and not necessarily the viewpoint character, and like like a Don Draper figure, in fact, in both in terms
Mm.
of his role within the larger drama and the fact that he is of the time, he's sexist, he is swaggering, and frankly sociopathic. And like I think I'd have him motivated at least partially by glory for Queen and country at the start, but I think if you drill down into his political outlook, to the extent that he has one, and this is true actually of the Bond as written originally,
Mm.
he is a fascist, and I think, or at least when it comes down to it, he doesn't really care about how Britain is run as a country or how it interferes with the larger world, as long as the rules don't really apply to him.
Right.
And I think over the subsequent series, because obviously it would get resyndicated because it's so successful. We see him grow and more monstrous, and it's a kind of like a real Walter White arc that I'm plotting for him. So by like season 4, he has demonstrated that he obeys no moral code whatsoever, and he's betrayed every ideal there is, and you absolutely despise him. And I think, maybe in the first season, he'd make a mistake on a mission and get someone killed and then lie about it without hesitation. And then by the second season, he's routinely doing at least one absolutely ghastly thing per mission. And then maybe he ends up, killing M because M is, beginning to get suspicious about his corruption. And ultimately, he becomes like the villain within that the rest of the cast of characters have to literally kill and finally free this franchise from the question of how you modernize Bond.
So you want a television series that just blow by blow, just completely from the inside out dismantles this character eventually evaporates them into dust,
Yes.
and then to be soon to be replaced by, perhaps something a bit different, but that is also equally exciting. Hopefully,
Well, yeah, I think. I mean, I think if these Bond films had been this new series of Bond films had ended up being made like 5 years later, they would have tried to MCU it.
yeah,
There
definitely, yeah.
and I think there's still the opportunity for that with a new reboot. But I don't know. For this, I think like tonally somewhere between like Vince Gilligan and maybe like Utopia. You remember the
Oh yeah,
TV
yeah,
series, the
yeah, yeah.
British TV series?
I do.
So like packaged in this sort of like cigarette stained 70s drab of Tinker Tailor, but with like a sort of heightened black comic lurid theatricality to it, maybe.
Man, Utopia was wild. I need to rewatch that. That was
Yeah, no, I mean that was really good, wasn't it? I didn't see the American remake of it. I don't know if that managed to carry through some of
mm,
the charm of the original, but it was just something very sinister and off key about it, which I really liked.
yeah, me too. Ooh.
Yeah, and I'd put front and center Britain's decaying imperial ambitions and its irrelevance and its immorality, and who wouldn't watch that in their droves, Tom?
I would watch it, and I would do a lock in on the Crate and Crowbar about it.
Very generous. Should we call it a day for this lock in?
I think I think we've covered all of the films. I think we've done it. I think.
Then I shall press this big red button and plunge you into the pool of sharks from which you will definitely not escape and destroy my plans. I'm just going to go off to my telescope,
Watch
my
out.
definitely not explosive
Be
telescope.
careful. Be very careful. I'm going onto a train, and
Oh, shit.
it was nice knowing everyone. It's nice.
Well, thanks for listening, everybody. That was a lock in. You can hear more of these sort of things on our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/Crate and Crowbar. You can sign up to our Patreon, patreon.com/Crate and Crowbar. You can join our Discord, the link for which is on our website, which is crateandcrowbar.com. I think that's it. I'm going to say that's it. I've been Marsh Davis.
I've been Tom Senior.
Thanks for
That's
listening,
everybody.
everybody.